April 1945. The last spring of the war. A pale sun hangs over a muddy road somewhere in Central Europe, its light touching a column of figures who no longer look like an army, nor civilians. They move slowly, wrapped in torn, striped cloth, leaning on one another because their legs can no longer carry them alone. Their breath makes no steam in the cold air. They are far too weak for that. A truck approaches from the distance, its engine rumbling over the broken asphalt. The column stiffens. For years, every sound of an engine has meant danger. The prisoners stop walking. Some close their eyes. Others simply stare at the ground. A girl near the front, thin, shaven-headed, perhaps 14 or 15, looks up. She sees uniforms, helmets, rifles. She cannot read the insignias. She only understands that armed men have arrived again. A soldier steps toward her. Her lips tremble. She forces out the only question that has lived in her mind since the day she was taken. Are you going to kill me? And to understand why a child had to ask that, we must go back to the beginning. Before the war, scattered millions across borders and barbed wire, Europe still carried the quiet rhythms of ordinary life. Families prepared meals in small kitchens. Children hurried to school with books under their arms. Radios hummed with music and evening news. The continent had scars from the First World War, but to many civilians, especially the youngest, those scars felt distant, like old photographs kept in drawers. In towns across Poland, Hungary, and Ukraine, a girl could still grow up believing that childhood was hers to keep. She might spend summers near fields that stretched beyond sight, winters beside stoves that glowed orange, and afternoons helping her mother with chores. Her world was small, but whole. She had no vocabulary for invasion, deportation, or camps. That vocabulary would come later, carried by soldiers and loudspeakers. Then came September 1939, when German forces crossed into Poland with a violence that stunned the world. Armored columns rolled across borders as aircraft circled overhead. Within weeks, Poland was partitioned, civilian authority collapsed, and the machinery of occupation began. New signs replaced old ones. New laws replaced familiar customs. Whole families found themselves suddenly classified not simply by age or address, but by blood, belief, and suspicion. For Jewish families, the transformation was immediate and merciless. Rights dissolved overnight. Stores were confiscated. Schools closed their doors. Curfews tightened. Radios were seized. Streets they had walked safely for generations became corridors watched by foreign uniforms. Ghettos emerged swiftly, walled districts where tens of thousands were pushed into cramped, unsanitary quarters. Disease spread. Food rations vanished. Hope thinned alongside the shrinking space. But the Nazi system did not target Jews alone. Roma families, political dissidents, disabled civilians, and anyone considered undesirable entered the same orbit of fear. At the same time, uniformed soldiers from many nations, Poles, Soviets, French, later British and American airmen, were captured and processed as prisoners of war, creating another category of captivity governed on paper by international rules, though often ignored in practice. Within this expanding labyrinth of prisoners, the distinction between civilian, racial target, and POW frequently blurred. In some occupied regions, entire Jewish populations were treated as enemy combatants by propaganda, even when unarmed. Children, unable to threaten anyone, were still swept into the same machinery. A girl of 14 could find herself treated as a prisoner of the state, a prisoner of ideology, and eventually a prisoner of war, as German forces retreated and transported captives deeper into the Reich. Our composite girl represents thousands who lived this progression. She remembers how the world narrowed one decree at a time. First came the armband, then the ghetto gate, then the knock on the door before dawn. By the time soldiers appeared with lists and shouted orders, she no longer recognized her own neighborhood. Her childhood disappeared into a swirl of shouting, boots, and the unfamiliar cold of fear. Arrest and deportation rarely arrived as dramatic scenes. More often, entire streets were emptied quietly, house by house, family by family. Prisoners were forced into trucks or marched to railway stations. No explanations were offered. The words resettlement or work echoed without meaning. Adults tried to reassure their children. though they themselves did not believe what they said. Survivors later described the moment of being herded into a freight wagon as the moment they understood that something irreversible had begun. Inside the wagon, darkness pressed against every breath. Dozens were crammed together with a bucket for sanitation and no water beyond what individuals brought with them. The train jolted forward without warning. Days blurred as the air thickened. Some wept, some prayed, some dissolved into silence. The girl stood between her mother and a stranger, gripping their arms to stay upright as the floor trembled beneath her. She did not yet know the names of the places these trains reached: Auschwitz, Majdanek, Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen. But she knew one thing: whatever waited at the end of the line was not the world she had left behind. And as the doors finally slid open, revealing floodlights, barking dogs, and shouting guards, the first breath of cold air carried with it the truth that childhood had ended. But the full weight of what that destination meant, the selections, the barracks, the numbers, the smoke would only become clear after she stepped onto the ramp and into a system designed to erase her completely. The barbed wire had not yet closed around her, but the world outside was already gone. When the train finally shuddered to a stop, silence rolled through the wagon like a new kind of fear. Then came the metallic scrape of the door, the burst of cold air, and the orders shouted in a language many prisoners did not understand. Floodlights washed over their faces. SS guards stood along the platform, rifles hanging easily in their hands, dogs straining against their leashes. The girl stepped down onto gravel, blinking as her eyes adjusted. The air smelled of smoke and something unfamiliar, something heavy. Around her, people clutched suitcases they had carried through the entire journey. Within minutes, most of those suitcases would be split open, searched, or simply taken. What mattered most now was not what she brought with her, but how old she appeared to be. At camps across occupied Europe, Auschwitz-Birkenau being the largest and most notorious, the first moments of arrival followed a brutal logic. SS doctors or officers conducted selections, deciding with a single gesture who would be kept for forced labor and who would be murdered immediately. To live or die often depended on height, posture, or the ability to walk steadily down a ramp after days without food. Teenage girls existed in a fragile category. Old enough to work, yet still visibly children, they hovered between survival and extermination. Many survivors later recalled older prisoners urging them to stand tall, to claim they were 16 or 18, to conceal weakness at all costs. In those seconds, a lie became a shield. Those selected for labor were marched through gates crowned with slogans, stripped of their clothes, shaved, disinfected, and issued coarse uniforms that erased individuality. Numbers replaced names. On arms, in ledgers, on barracks. Lists. The transformation from person to prisoner was immediate and methodical. The girl who stepped from the train with a family name now answered to a sequence of digits barked during roll call. Inside the barracks, conditions were shaped by overcrowding, hunger, and the constant presence of death. Wooden bunks stacked 3 tiers high sagged under the weight of too many bodies. Lice and disease spread quickly. The weakened died during the night without a sound. In the morning, fellow prisoners carried them outside before the count began. Labor assignments varied, sorting through confiscated belongings, hauling bricks, digging trenches, carrying stones, or working in factories connected to the German war effort. Every task drained strength needed to survive the next day. Food rations, watery soup, a piece of bread. Sometimes nothing were calculated to maintain workers just above collapse. Beyond the fences, the wider war was shifting. In 1943, after catastrophic German losses on the Eastern Front, the tide began to turn. Allied bombers appeared over German cities. Soviet armies advanced westward. Rumors seeped through the camp networks like faint currents of air. Battles won. Front lines collapsing. German retreats. But for prisoners inside the wire, these changes felt impossibly distant. Hope was a dangerous thing. By 1944, the Nazis accelerated deportations, especially of Hungarian Jews, attempting to destroy entire communities even as military defeat loomed. Trains arrived day after day. Smoke rose day after day. The machinery of extermination operated with ruthless efficiency, even as the Reich itself was crumbling. As Soviet forces approached major camp complexes, the SS attempted to hide the evidence. Crematoria were blown up. documents burned. Prisoners, tens of thousands, were forced on long marches toward camps deeper inside Germany. These would come to be known as death marches, named not by metaphor, but by outcome. Anyone who fell behind was shot. Snow and mud became burial grounds. For the girl, the march marked a new phase of captivity. The camp gates no longer confined her, but the open road offered no freedom. The guards drove the column forward through villages reduced to ruins and forests echoing with artillery. Exhaustion etched itself into every step. Yet, even in this final act of brutality, the war was closing in. German units retreated chaotically. Front lines shifted by the day. Allied forces advanced from the west. Soviet divisions pressed from the east. To soldiers on both sides, every encounter carried confusion, civilians fleeing, troops surrendering, prisoners wandering half dead across the countryside. Somewhere between collapsing German command and the rumble of approaching armies, the girl found herself no longer behind barbed wire, but still not free. The march had ended not with release, but with abandonment, guards fleeing, gunfire in the distance, prisoners stranded on a road that led nowhere familiar. And it was here, in this fragile space between captivity and liberation, that she would soon face the man with the rifle, the moment where years of terror distilled into a single question. For a teenage girl inside the Nazi camp system, the world had been reduced to a set of instincts. Stay unnoticed, stay alive, stay close to anyone who might protect you for one more day. Childhood ended the moment she was pushed from the train into a reality where the routines of extermination overshadowed every breath. In testimonies, survivors often described the first nights as a blur of cold, hunger, and disbelief. The girl slept wedged between strangers on a splintered bunk, listening to the coughing, the whispering, the muffled sobs of people trying to remember their own names. She learned quickly that weakness invited danger. Guards struck without warning, and capos, themselves prisoners, enforced order with whatever cruelty ensured their own survival. Every day demanded calculations: how to ration a crust of bread, how to hide an injury, how to stand during roll call without collapsing. Girls her age often clung to older women, camp mothers, who offered guidance, pieces of bread, or simple reminders to keep fighting for one more sunrise. Bonds formed not as luxuries, but as lifelines. In a place built to strip people of their humanity, these small alliances were acts of resistance. Fear lived in every movement. Selections loomed constantly. A limp, a cough, a moment of dizziness could mark someone as unfit. The girl watched people disappear, taken behind buildings, marched out of sight, or simply failing to return from labor shifts. At night, she lay awake, trying not to imagine where they had gone. The human angle of her story is not a single emotion, but a spectrum: terror, numbness, protective detachment, flickers of hope, and a fierce instinct to endure. What kept her alive was not strength in the traditional sense, but the ability to adapt, to read danger in footsteps, to follow the unwritten rules, and to cling to the smallest reasons to keep moving. Years later, many survivors would say that the most painful memories were not the punishments or the hunger, but watching others lose the will to rise. In that world, survival was not triumph, it was simply the refusal to surrender. And within that fragile refusal, her story continued. Behind her suffering stood a system built with cold efficiency. The Nazi concentration camp network was not a chaotic collection of prisons. It was an organized, meticulously catalogued machinery of forced labor and mass murder. Every block, every command, every transport followed a pattern established through bureaucracy and ideology. Camps were divided into sectors: administrative offices, barracks, factories, punishment blocks, and extermination facilities. SS officers directed operations, while guards patrolled with trained dogs and loaded weapons. Capos, often chosen from criminal prisoners, maintained order inside barracks and work details. The entire structure functioned through a hierarchy of control that ensured no prisoner had the means to resist. Paperwork supported everything. Prisoners were sorted, numbered, registered, assigned. Their labor was tracked. Their rations were measured. Their deaths were recorded with chilling normality. Even the youngest prisoners became entries in ledgers, consumed by a system designed to erase individual stories. Within this machine, punishment was not arbitrary. It was policy. Escapes, minor infractions, or suspected disobedience triggered reprisals. Roll calls lasted for hours in freezing temperatures. Collective punishment was common. Discipline served a purpose: to break the human spirit and maintain the illusion of total control. Factories associated with the camps fed the German war effort. Clothing depots, munitions workshops, and chemical plants absorbed forced labor with little regard for survival. Starvation was built into the schedule. Exhaustion was part of the calculation. The girl never understood the full structure around her. No child could, but she felt it constantly. Every order shouted at her originated from layers of authority she would never see. Every march, every inspection, every beating reflected a wider system moving relentlessly behind the scenes. From the SS perspective, she was a unit of labor. From the camp's perspective, she was a number. From the ideology that created it all, she was not meant to survive. This system, rigid and lethal, shaped every moment of her existence until its structure finally began to crack under the pressure of a war turning against Germany. To understand her greatest moment of terror, we must step briefly into the world of those who held the rifles. The men who guarded the camps were not a single, uniform group. Some were committed ideologues, steeped in Nazi beliefs about race and hierarchy. Others were regular soldiers reassigned from the front, or older reservists given guard duty as their bodies failed them in combat. Some were foreign auxiliaries recruited from occupied territories, following orders without understanding the full machinery they had entered. To many of these guards, prisoners were not individuals but categories: Jews, Roma, Poles, enemies of the state. Training conditioned them to see prisoners as subhuman, dangerous, or worthless. Violence became habitual. Killing, in many instances, was treated as routine. Yet history also records moments of hesitation, small acts of mercy buried beneath the weight of systemic brutality. A guard looking away so a prisoner could rest. A stolen potato passed through a fence. A warning whispered before a selection. These moments did not redeem the system. They merely revealed that individuals still retained the capacity for choice, even inside an environment built to eliminate it. But such choices were rare. The majority executed their orders without question. They watched marches, punished the weak, and maintained the deadly discipline expected of them. To the girl, any man in uniform represented one thing: danger. She had seen uniformed men drag families from homes, beat prisoners in the yard, and shoot those who collapsed on the marches. She had learned that rifles meant power, and power meant death. So when she found herself face to face with a soldier in the closing months of the war, stranded on a road with the guards fled or killed, she braced for the worst. In her mind, there was no distinction between enemy and liberator. They all wore helmets. They all carried guns. That fear, born from years of conditioning, explains the question she would soon ask. It also explains why the answer mattered so deeply. For inside this machinery of dehumanization, a single human response could pierce through everything the system had tried to teach her about armed men. And on the edge of liberation, that moment was about to arrive. In the final months of the war, Allied and Soviet forces advanced across Europe with a momentum that seemed unstoppable. Their focus remained firmly on military objectives, towns, bridges, strategic crossings, but they increasingly encountered scenes that did not resemble battlefields at all. Columns of prisoners wandering without guards, abandoned barracks, rail cars filled with starving people, roads lined with bodies left behind by retreating SS units. For many soldiers, these were the first signs of a world they did not yet have words for. Western Allied troops had been prepared to take German soldiers prisoner under the Geneva Convention. Procedures existed for disarming, processing, and relocating enemy combatants. Training manuals detailed how to search captured units, identify officers, and move prisoners to holding camps. None of these manuals included instructions for identifying victims of mass starvation or distinguishing between survivors of concentration camps and civilian refugees fleeing frontline violence. Soviet troops, advancing from the east, had seen the worst of German occupation firsthand: obliterated villages, mass graves, civilian reprisals, yet even they were struck by the scale of what they found behind the barbed wire. Soldiers accustomed to hardened battlefields suddenly faced skeletal children unable to stand, women collapsing at their feet, and men who no longer resembled soldiers or civilians. Liberation was not triumph, it was shock. In many cases, prisoners themselves did not understand who had arrived. They saw uniforms and weapons, not insignias. They heard commands shouted in languages they could not decipher. It was impossible to know, in those first seconds, whether the armed men approaching them intended harm or rescue. For Allied soldiers, the challenge was immediate. They had to provide aid, prevent chaos, and continue advancing toward their objectives, all while absorbing the reality of crimes that defied imagination. War diaries and letters described these encounters with a mixture of rage, sorrow, and disbelief. Some soldiers recorded that the prisoners they found were too weak to even cheer. Others remembered the silence most vividly, the eerie quiet of people who had learned that speaking openly could get them killed. The discovery of these prisoners reshaped the understanding of the war for many soldiers. Their mission no longer felt like a struggle against a distant regime. It became personal, tangible, urgent, and among those rescued were children who had known nothing but captivity for years, now staring at their liberators with fear rather than gratitude. Soon, one of those soldiers would be the man standing in front of a teenage girl on a muddy road, his weapon slung at his side, her question trembling in the air. Liberation did not restore people to health. It merely removed the immediate threat of death. The human body, after months or years of starvation, cold, and disease, was fragile beyond anything most medical personnel had seen. Army doctors and nurses, trained for battlefield injuries, suddenly faced symptoms of long-term deprivation. Swollen limbs from edema, skeletal frames with failing organs, high fevers caused by typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis. The challenge was not simply to feed survivors. In fact, doing so too quickly could kill them. Many liberators had to learn, on the spot, the dangers of refeeding syndrome, a condition where the sudden introduction of calories into a starved body shocked the system. Some survivors died in the arms of the very men who had come to save them. Psychologically, the trauma was just as acute. Prisoners emerging from camps had been conditioned to obey commands instantly, to avoid eye contact, to hide any sign of vulnerability. Some recoiled from rescuers, fearing punishment. Others remained motionless, unable to interpret what liberation meant. A few tried to run, not toward freedom, but simply away from uniforms, from authority, from memories that clung to every corner of their minds. For children, the confusion was overwhelming. Many had forgotten what home meant. Many had no surviving family. Their identities had been stripped, their sense of time distorted. They lived in a permanent state of alertness where the wrong gesture could mean death. To them, a man holding a rifle could never be safe. This is why so many testimonies from survivors include descriptions like, "I thought they were going to kill us," or "I was afraid to speak," or "I didn't know who they were." Liberation, for them, was not a sudden rush of relief. It was a moment of terror, then hesitation, then slowly dawning understanding. For the girl on the road, her body weakened by cold and hunger, her mind shaped by years under the shadow of violence, there was only one thought when the soldier approached: "He can hurt me. All men with rifles can." Her question arose from this truth, not from misunderstanding, but from experience. And the way he answered would become the defining memory of her survival. At the heart of every war lies a simple reality: power flows to the person holding the weapon. In that moment between a prisoner and a soldier, one decision can seal a life or return it. Throughout history, systems of oppression have relied on individuals to act without reflection. Orders were obeyed. Violence was normalized. In the Nazi camp system, this obedience became lethal routine. Guards followed commands, perhaps believing they had no choice, perhaps believing deeply in the ideology that sanctioned killing. Yet, even in totalitarian systems, individuals still make decisions, small ones, often unnoticed, but morally decisive. When the soldier in 1945 stood before the girl, he carried the weight of a world scarred by war, brutality, and loss. He had seen comrades fall, had fought through ruined towns, had watched German soldiers surrender in waves. He was exhausted, he was armed, and he was trained to assess threats quickly. The girl, trembling, barefoot, skeletal, asked him a question that did not belong on a battlefield. "Are you going to kill me?" That question confronted him with the stark contrast between the war he had fought and the horror he now witnessed. This was not an enemy combatant, not a threat, just a child shaped by suffering. His answer calm, steady, certain cut through the legacy of fear surrounding her. He chose not to continue the cycle of violence. He chose to reassure rather than command. In doing so, he gave her something she had not possessed for years: safety without conditions. In a war defined by dehumanization, this moment was a restoration of humanity. And as the front lines collapsed around them, as armies pushed toward final victory, the true turning point for her life approached, not in the roar of battle, but in a single, merciful exchange on a quiet road. By the winter of 1945, the Third Reich was in collapse. What had once been an expanding empire stretching across Europe shrank by the week as Allied forces closed in from every direction. Inside Germany's borders, orders spread through the concentration camp network: evacuate the prisoners, leave nothing behind for the approaching armies to discover, destroy documents, torch facilities, and send tens of thousands of captives on foot to camps deeper inside the Reich. For the girl, the command reached her block before dawn. Guards stormed through the barracks, shouting, dragging prisoners from bunks, forcing them into the icy dark. Snowflakes brushed her bare skin as she stumbled into line, clutching the thin, striped fabric around her shoulders. She had survived selections, beatings, and disease. Now she was being marched into a landscape of frozen fields and burning villages where death waited on every roadside. The columns moved slowly, hundreds at a time, stretched across miles of countryside. Those who faltered were beaten, those who collapsed were shot. This cruelty was not spontaneous, it was procedure. The SS had long used marching as a method of control, forcing prisoners to expend the last of their strength until only a fraction survived. With the front collapsing, the violence intensified. Prisoners were no longer simply being moved, they were being erased. The girl walked among them, one foot forward, then the next, the cold numbing her thoughts. She no longer remembered the taste of real food or the feeling of warmth. All she knew was the rhythm of boots behind her, the crack of gunfire somewhere up the line, and the constant fear that her legs would give out before the day ended. Villages flickered past like scenes glimpsed through a veil. Some residents watched silently, powerless or unwilling to intervene. Others kept doors closed, shutters drawn. No one dared approach a column guarded by soldiers who shot without hesitation. The war had transformed ordinary landscapes into corridors of fear. At night, the prisoners were herded into barns, factories, or open fields. They lay huddled together, too cold to sleep, too hungry to think. The girl listened to whispers, names repeated like prayers, directions spoken as if someone still believed they might reach home again, warnings of guards rumored to be more brutal than the rest. In the dark, reality thinned. Tomorrow was a distant thing. The march stretched on. Days lost their boundaries. Snow turned to slush, then to mud that clung to their ankles like weights. Bodies stiffened beside the roadside, half hidden beneath branches or straw. No one was allowed to stop long enough to mourn. To pause was to risk a rifle muzzle pressing into one's back. Yet the war itself was overtaking them. Artillery thundered in the distance. Aircraft droned overhead. Columns of German refugees fled in the opposite direction, carrying children on their backs, pushing carts piled with blankets and pots. The roads were crowded with the displaced civilians, soldiers, prisoners, all moving without a clear destination, all trying to outrun the same tide. One evening, as the column approached a crossroads, the guards' discipline frayed. Rumors spread among the prisoners that the front line was approaching faster than expected. Guards argued among themselves. Some shouted for increased pace, others looked nervously toward the horizon. A handful quietly slipped away under cover of dusk, abandoning their posts. By dawn, chaos had replaced order. The girl awoke to find the guards fewer in number, their voices strained and uncertain. They marched the prisoners for another hour, before distant gunfire echoed again, not the sharp cracks of executions, but the rolling volleys of battle. The guards paused. Some exchanged tense glances. Then, in a moment that would later repeat in countless survivor accounts, they fled. One ran first, then another. Within minutes, the columns of prisoners were left standing on the side of a road, without direction, without threats, without anyone holding their fate in check. Freedom did not wash over them in a sudden wave. There was no cheering, no collapse of relief, only disbelief. Years of conditioning had taught them that danger lived in every shadow, that a gun could be raised at any moment, that orders dictated survival. Now there were no orders, and the silence felt dangerous. The girl stood in the half-light, surrounded by others who looked as lost as she felt. Some whispered about hiding in the woods. Others argued they should stay together. A few simply sank to the ground, too weak to stand, without the structure of compulsion. Then came another sound. Different voices, different engines. Not the rumble of German trucks, but lower, deeper, unmistakably foreign. The prisoners turned toward the noise, fear tightening in their chests. A column of military vehicles approached tanks, trucks, and infantry, advancing through the debris of war. The soldiers wore unfamiliar helmets, carried rifles angled toward the road ahead, and scanned the terrain with the caution of men who had learned never to trust what they saw. They did not slow at first. Liberators were still soldiers. Danger still lurked everywhere. The girl's heart seized. She had seen too many armed men to believe these were different. After everything she had lived through, she knew only one truth. Whoever holds the gun decides who lives. The soldiers halted. Engines hummed. Weapons stayed drawn. And the moment suspended itself in history. Two worlds, staring at each other across a few meters of mud. One, exhausted beyond recognition. The other, unprepared for what it saw. This is where her question would be born. But the answer, unexpected, quiet, profoundly human, still waited a few breaths away. The soldiers stepped down from their vehicles cautiously, boots sinking into the wet earth. They had been fighting their way across Europe for months, encountering ambushes, surrendering units, and villages where danger often hid behind broken walls. Approaching a group of ragged figures on the road was not, at first, unusual. War had left thousands displaced. But as they drew closer, the truth revealed itself. These were not refugees, not soldiers, not townspeople, fleeing bombardment. They were prisoners. The striped uniforms, the gaunt faces, the hollow eyes, every detail told a story the soldiers had only heard in rumors. Some had read intelligence briefings hinting at German labor installations. Others had dismissed those reports as exaggerations. But now, confronted with the physical evidence, theories collapsed into reality. The prisoners did not move. They watched the soldiers with the stillness of people who had learned that any sudden motion could draw punishment. A few raised their hands weakly. Most simply stood waiting, barely breathing. They had no way to distinguish between enemy and liberator. One soldier, younger than the war he carried on his shoulders, stepped forward. His rifle hung from its sling, pointing toward the ground, but its presence was enough to send a ripple of fear through the group. He saw people starved, trembling, eyes sunken into shadow, yet they reacted to him as though he were a threat. He hesitated. Then he approached slowly, palms open, moving with the deliberate care one uses around the injured or frightened. The girl stood near the front. She had survived the march, more by instinct than strength. Her feet bled from the cold. Her breath came in fragile bursts. But as the soldier advanced, it wasn't her body that failed her, it was her memory. Every uniform she had ever seen had brought violence. Every rifle had signaled danger. Every order had preceded suffering. She could not imagine a soldier who meant anything else. The idea of rescue did not exist in her vocabulary. The soldier said something gentle, steady, but she didn't understand the language. The words meant nothing. The rifle meant everything. Years of conditioning flooded her mind. Stay still. Don't anger them. Don't make a mistake. Don't look directly at the weapon. Her voice, unused for hours, cracked as she formed the only question that fit the world she had known. A world where soldiers decided life and death with the simplest of gestures. She whispered, barely audible, "Are you going to kill me?" The soldier froze. The wind paused around them. Even the other prisoners seemed to hold their breath. He had expected fear, maybe confusion, but not this. Not a child, reduced by years of brutality to believing that death was the default outcome of meeting an armed man. For a moment he did not speak, not because he was unsure, but because the weight of her question struck him harder than any artillery blast. When he finally answered, his voice was low, calm, almost disbelieving that such reassurance needed to be said aloud. "No, you're safe now." She stared at him, searching his face for the lie that had accompanied every promise from every guard she had ever known. But he did not shout. He did not raise his weapon. He did not demand she stand straighter or move faster. He simply waited, hands open, offering the one thing she had forgotten how to recognize: safety. Other soldiers began unloading supplies, blankets, water, rations. Medics hurried forward. Some knelt beside prisoners, checking pulses, offering sips of liquid. One placed a coat around a woman's shoulders. Another guided a staggering man to sit against the side of a truck. The entire scene unfolded with a quiet urgency, as though every second mattered. The girl remained rooted where she stood. She didn't reach for the water first. She didn't move toward the blankets. Her mind struggled to catch up with a reality in which she was not in immediate danger. The soldier extended his hand. She hesitated, then, slowly, placed her fingers in his palm. Her hand was weightless, fragile. He closed his around it gently and guided her toward the medics. Behind her, the other prisoners began to understand. The tension in the column loosened by degrees. Murmurs spread. Some collapsed the moment they realized the march was over. Some wept silently. Others simply stared, trying to believe that the nightmare had finally reached its end. The girl felt the soldier release her hand only after she was seated on a blanket beside the road. A medic knelt and checked her pulse, shaking his head at how weak it was. She heard voices, unfamiliar words, soft tones, then the rustle of supplies being opened. But above all the noise, one moment echoed in her mind. She had asked if she was about to die, and someone with a gun had answered her with mercy, not violence. Liberation was not a celebration. It was a fragile, quiet shift, the first breath of air that did not carry fear. And in that fragile space, her life was no longer governed by commands, but by care. The war around them still raged. Battles continued across the continent. But for her, the turning point had already come and gone. It arrived not with the roar of tanks or the collapse of the Reich, but with a single sentence spoken on a muddy road between two exhausted human beings. Liberation did not end suffering. It merely shifted it into a different form. Once the soldiers secured the road, they began the urgent task of gathering the survivors. Trucks were repositioned, blankets were distributed, medics marked the weakest for immediate evacuation. The girl, still wrapped in the coat one soldier had placed around her shoulders, felt herself guided into the back of a vehicle lined with straw. Dozens of others were lifted beside her, some conscious, some barely breathing. The ride to the nearest field hospital was slow. The roads were clogged with retreating German units, civilian refugees, and other liberated prisoners wandering aimlessly across the countryside. Each kilometer felt like an entire day. When they finally arrived at a hastily converted schoolhouse or barracks, the girl was carried inside, her weight so little that a single medic could lift her as though she were made of cloth. Inside, rows of cots stretched across the floors. Nurses and doctors moved between them with controlled urgency. They had seen battlefield wounds, amputations, burns, but starvation presented a different challenge. Bodies that had been deprived for too long reacted unpredictably. Some survivors died within hours of liberation, not because they were harmed, but because the fragile balance inside their bodies collapsed once the constant threat lifted. The girl clung to life quietly. She slept for long stretches, drifting in and out of a hazy awareness. When she woke, she found herself wrapped in clean sheets, a taste of broth on her tongue, a faint warmth replacing the cold that had lived in her bones for years. She watched nurses move gently, their voices calm, their hands steady. She watched soldiers stand guard at the doors, not to keep her in, but to keep danger out. It took time before her mind accepted this difference. Doctors assessed each survivor's condition, recording every name they could. But names were fragile things now. Many prisoners could barely remember theirs. Some recited numbers instead, repeating them in fear that forgetting might somehow cost them their existence. Weeks passed before the girl regained enough strength to stand without support. When she finally saw herself in a small mirror, cheeks sunken, arms thin as branches, she barely recognized the reflection. Yet the sight did not frighten her. She had feared far worse. As the front lines moved deeper into Germany and the war neared its end, liberated prisoners were transferred from emergency hospitals into displaced persons, DP, camps, centers set up by the Allies to provide food, housing, and attempts at normalcy for millions left without homes. The girl was moved again, this time with less urgency, to a DP camp established in a former military base. The fences that once separated soldiers from civilians now surrounded those who had been denied freedom for so long. But this confinement was different. The gates were open. The guards were there to protect. The routines, meals, roll calls, medical checks were meant to stabilize, not punish. Inside the camp, she met others her age. Some had survived ghettos. Others had hidden in barns or forests. A few had been transported from camps she had never heard of. They shared stories in fragments, as if full sentences were too heavy to speak. Many had no families left. Others desperately scanned lists posted by relief agencies, searching for familiar names. Education programs began slowly. First simple lessons, then attempts to rebuild schooling. The girl held a pencil again for the first time since the war began. Her hand shook. She wrote only her first name, unsure if her family name still existed. Psychologically, the transition from prisoner to liberated person was uneven. Some survivors clung to blankets, sleeping with food hidden beneath pillows. Others panicked at the sound of boots in hallways. The girl startled whenever a man in uniform walked past, even if he wore the insignia of the army that had saved her. Trauma did not understand the difference. Yet, day by day, she added small victories. A full meal, a moment of laughter, a warm bath, a night without waking in terror, the slow rebuilding of a self that had been nearly extinguished. And through all of it, one memory stayed with her, not as a wound, but as an anchor. The moment on the road, when she had asked a question shaped by years of torment, and the answer that had begun to restore her faith in life. That sentence became the first stable point in a world that had been shattered. But survival was only the beginning. Beyond healing lay a larger, lifelong search for identity, for home, for a future no longer defined by fear. As Europe struggled to rebuild itself from the ruins of war, displaced persons' camps became temporary worlds of their own, places where nations, ages, and histories mixed together under makeshift roofs. The girl, no longer starving but still fragile, lived through the long, uncertain months as governments debated borders, citizenship, and the fate of millions who had lost everything. Information trickled in slowly. The Red Cross published lists. Survivors compared scraps of memory, hoping to reconstruct the past enough to find relatives. Many discovered that their towns no longer existed, their families gone, their histories interrupted beyond repair. The girl waited for news, but none arrived. Silence became its own confirmation, yet life persisted around her. Relief workers organized classes, religious services, community gatherings. Photographs were taken for identification papers. Interviews were conducted to determine resettlement eligibility. Some refugees were sent back to their countries of origin. Others refused to return to places that held only ghosts. For Jewish survivors, the DP camps became staging grounds for emigration toward the United States, Canada, Australia, South America, and, increasingly, toward the land of Israel. As she recovered, the girl found herself drawn to simple routines, sweeping floors in the dormitory, helping distribute bread, learning new languages from volunteers who had arrived from abroad. She spoke little of the past. Most survivors didn't. Silence was not avoidance, it was survival. To relive the years behind barbed wire too soon was to risk breaking open wounds that had barely begun to heal. What she held onto instead was a single sentence. In that vast landscape of suffering, one moment stood apart with clarity. A soldier lowering his rifle, speaking softly, promising she would not be harmed. That memory became the foundation upon which she rebuilt her trust in the world. She told it to no one, but it lived within her, steady and unwavering. In time, her path led her away from Europe. She boarded a ship crowded with other young survivors and families seeking new beginnings. The voyage was long, but she felt no fear of the open water. She had survived a world far more dangerous than the sea. When she stepped onto foreign soil, whether America, Israel, or another place, offering refuge, her first breath tasted like possibility. The following decades unfolded quietly, but steadily. She found work. She learned a trade, or a profession. She married, or perhaps she didn't, but she built relationships rooted not in desperation, but in choice. She raised children, or helped to raise others' children, teaching them, knowingly or not, that life was something to be protected, not taken for granted. Many survivors avoided sharing their past until they were older. For decades, she may have spoken little of her childhood, choosing instead to focus on living rather than remembering. Only later, when her voice grew steadier and the world began asking more urgently about the Holocaust, did she begin to share pieces of her story. When she finally sat down for a recorded testimony, one of thousands collected in oral history projects in the late 20th century, she spoke in measured tones. She described the ghetto, the train, the camp, the march. But when she reached the moment of liberation, she paused. Her eyes, in that recording, held both the weight of the past and the clarity of a single instant that had changed her life. She told the interviewer that she had been certain the soldier would shoot her. She had no reason to believe otherwise. But when she asked, "Are you going to kill me?" and heard the answer no, "You're safe now," something broke open inside her. Not fear, not despair. Something simpler and more extraordinary, the return of trust. Historians analyze liberation in terms of troop movements, casualty figures, medical logistics, and political consequences. But survivors remember liberation in human moments, often small, fragile, and deeply personal. A blanket offered, a hand extended, a rifle lowered, a word spoken gently. Years later, she would say, "I don't remember his name. I don't remember his face clearly, but I remember his voice. I remember those words. They stayed with me. They helped me live." Her life became a testament not only to endurance, but to the power of a single act of mercy. In a world that had shown her unimaginable cruelty, one quiet answer proved that humanity could still exist. And as her story draws to its close, that moment, simple, brief, yet profound, offers a lens through which to understand the entire war and the fragile hope that emerged from its ruins. History often tells the story of World War II through vast movements, armies crossing continents, governments rising and falling, maps shifting like tides. We learn dates, strategies, numbers. We speak about victory and defeat as if they were simple, measurable things. Yet in the shadows of those sweeping events lived millions of individual moments, each carrying a truth that statistics can never capture. The girl's question, "Are you going to kill me?" came from a world in which violence had become normal, expected, almost routine. To her, death was not an abstract fear, but a daily possibility shaped by the decisions of men holding rifles. It was the logic of the camps. Power meant danger, and childhood offered no protection. But the answer she received revealed another truth, just as powerful. Wars are fought by systems, but they are lived through by people. And in that quiet exchange on a muddy road, a soldier chose something beyond orders or training. He chose to affirm life in a place where life had been systematically taken. The significance of that moment stretches beyond her story. It reminds us that even in the darkest landscapes of human history, the capacity for empathy does not fully vanish. It survives in individual decisions, small, unrecorded, yet immeasurably important. A lowered weapon, a gentle tone, the refusal to harm someone who has already suffered beyond measure. Her life after the war, rebuilt piece by fragile piece, stands as evidence that a single act of mercy can echo across decades. She grew, healed, and eventually spoke her truth, not because a system rescued her, but because one human being, in a moment of great power, chose compassion instead of cruelty. Today, when we look back at the ruins and reckon with the consequences, her story offers a quiet reminder. History is not shaped only by those who command armies or sign decrees. It is also shaped by the ordinary people who decide, in moments no one else witnesses, whether to inflict pain or offer kindness. And for one girl on a forgotten road in 1945, the future began with a question and a life-saving answer whispered against the noise of a dying war.